Dr. Curiale, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be asked to speak with you.
We could start maybe with The Tonight Show.
Okay.
So you were the arranger for the show. Could you talk a little bit about that? How did you get that gig, and what exactly was your role behind the scenes with the music?
Well, I grew up since childhood watching The Tonight Show, the Johnny Carson show. That was on pretty much since I was a little boy. And, of course, I was a trumpet player, pretty much a jazz trumpet player at the time. So it was a treat to get to see Doc Severinsen. And in the trumpet section, they were all jazz legends. And pretty much throughout the whole band, they were jazz. The problem was it was started at 11:30 at night. It was the most famous late-night talk show for, I think at least 30 years. So I used to sneak to try to watch them, and it was an icon. Those musicians played in some of the greatest big bands of all time. They were all pretty much kind of legendary musicians and studio players. So when I got to Hollywood in 1980, the first 2 years were kind of rough, like they are for most people. You have to get to know people and try to get going. When I got there, before there, I was living in Japan for about 1.5 years, and while I was there, I wrote a big band book because I couldn't do anything in Japan other than, I couldn't work outside the visa that I had. So when I got to Hollywood, I had a pretty nice big band book, and I moved there during the musician strike in 1980, which was good news, bad news. The good news was that the studio players wanted to keep their chops up, so they were going to various colleges and universities and sitting in with the big bands there. And so I didn't know many people, but I did have an introduction to some of the, the really good college bands, and, like LA City College and Northridge and different places. And there was a great rehearsal band that was started by North Texas State 1 O'Clock band member who graduated, and it was called the LA Jazz Workshop. And I went there, and I brought some charts. They kind of looking at me like, who's this guy? And,
how old were you at that time?
I was 25, and I brought some charts, and I just thought, that was the whole point of that. They'd read through stuff, and it was like the best young musicians that were coming out of college and university in the LA area, and they were really, really, really good. And but there were ringers in there. Again, some of the studio players were in there, and then the guy said, "Well, come, go ahead and rehearse your charts," and I did, and they just played the heck out of it. And then after they loved the music and going like, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" I said, "Well, I just moved from Japan. I don't really know anybody." And they said, "You should get your own band together." I'm going, "Well, I don't know anybody. How am I going to get a band together?" And they were just going, these are the studio players. They're going, "Oh, we'll make the calls for you." In a very short time, they just called like everybody. I mean, Peter Erskine was in my band. He's not full time, but because people would rotate. But these are people, and the bass player from Tonight Show actually, who's he played with so many people, a big list of people. Joel DiBartolo was his name, my almost the entire brass section was the brass section of one of my favorite albums called Buddy Rich's Roar of '74. I mean, a really incredible album. And so a lot of these people, they were all in LA, and so they just really, for some reason, were endeared to me and loved the music, and they were willing to, call people in my behalf. And, I was starving, and I didn't have any work yet, and, really struggling, yet I felt very positive every day. I'm going, wow, all these great musicians are coming down to the Musicians Union for free, battling the traffic in the morning and playing, my stuff for a couple of hours. And so that's how it kind of started. And then one day, Joel DiBartolo said, I think Doc Severinsen would like your stuff. I was like, I melted because I ex-trumpet player, and I saw Doc when I was in high school and had all his records. And so he and a trumpet player that I knew previously from my very first recorded piece was on Woody Herman's album, Roadfather. It was a direct-to-disc album, and this guy named Nelson Hatt was on that album, and he was in LA, and he remembered me and really helped me a lot. He knew a lot of people, and he introduced me very graciously to a lot of people. So we Went to NBC, to the National Broadcasting Corporation, where the Tonight Show was, taped. And I'm sitting there at the rehearsal in the afternoon, and all of a sudden I see Doc walk in. I just thought I was going to pass out, just like, because he was really like one of my trumpet idols.
Was he the music director for the band?
Yeah, he was, and he was a star himself because he used to dress really flashy. And when the normal sidekick of Johnny Carson was off, Doc would take that position. So, the band played regularly. So, like when they went to commercial, the band would be playing these charts, and really they were burning. And these guys were so good. And so when they'd cut back from commercial and you'd see Johnny again, Doc would stop the band. The audience would roar. Because the music was incredible. So they were the definitive band at the time. I mean, it's very different than the Tonight Shows now, which are like small groups and kind of funk and everything.
People don't realize that the audience back then was many magnitudes larger than they are now. The Tonight Show audience was in the multi-millions.
Oh my God. I mean, everybody watched that show. Again, it was like the number one late night show for 30 years. I mean, how do you sustain that for 30 years? I mean, every other show was fashioned after the Johnny Carson show. I mean, David Letterman, and now there's new incarnations, with Jimmy Fallon, and there was Jay Leno before that. So there were a lot of those shows, but none of them. Letterman was the one that came closest in a way, and they had a great band. That was the New York band, but they had Will Lee in it, and just amazing musicians as well. But it wasn't a big band like Doc had, and it cost a lot of money to do that. And yet, Johnny Carson loved music. He was a kind of a frustrated drummer himself, and so. Buddy Rich would be on often. Louis Bellson would be on. He'd have all different.
Did you get to meet Johnny? Did you get to talk to him?
Something? I was so shy that he was there sometimes, and I regret that I never went up and introduced myself. And even after the show had ended, and I was already, I had already done these beautiful albums with the London Symphony and everything, I wanted to write a letter to him. I don't think I did, and I wanted to thank him for basically giving me a start in my career, even though he didn't know it personally. It was his love of music and his love of big band music that gave me an opportunity to be a writer for the show. So how I became a writer was Doc, I got to know Doc much better after that. But he was practicing as he was walking in. He practices compulsively. I mean, why he's so good. And so my friends, Joel DeBartolo and Nelson were like introducing me to him, and he still has the horn on his mouth. And then he just puts it down for a minute, and he just goes, "Well, why don't you bring a chart sometime?" And being that I was very shy at that time. It was remarkable that I would actually have brought one. And I brought one, and I had it behind my back. And I said, well, I brought one. And he goes, well, go rehearse the band. And I thought, oh, I'm going to die. I am definitely I'm going to pass out, and I'm going to die. Because these are all my heroes.
You must have talked a lot. Did you talk personally with him and talk about music and ask him a lot of questions about his career and who he liked and his influences?
Definitely not at that time. I mean, I always felt that less was better because Doc is a very unusual guy. And later I got, like when I did the symphonic things, which I'll tell you about in a minute, then we had a different relationship. But he just goes, well, go rehearse the band. And so I brought a chart. So many of my trumpet heroes were right there, and my legs were shaking, man. But I didn't look like that, but inside I was going, oh my God, please God, get me through this, And they played it down, and they played it really great. And when it was over, one of my favorite jazz trumpet players, his name was Conte Condoli, and he just goes, yeah, he was like that kind of model of a beatnik from the 50s.
Right.
It's like, yeah, man. You're going to do great, man. And then Doc just goes, before he went to rehearse the band for what they were going to play in the show, he just goes, well, keep writing for me. I went, okay. And I was like, really, oh my God, is times 1,000. And so I went back to my friend's house. I had no place to live, really. And
that's incredible.
And that's pretty tough. in Hollywood, and it was just this the graciousness of this trumpet player friend Nelson Hatt, who a studio player who really believed in what I was doing. And at one point I was so like worried about how I'm even going to live that I said, I think I'm just going to go back to Japan. And he goes, no, don't do that. I said, I don't have any place to live. And he said, well, he goes, you can sleep at his house. So that night I was sleeping on the floor in his storeroom.
Oh, wow.
Between stacks of books. And 11:30 comes around. I figured, I'll watch The Tonight Show. And he was there too, so we were both watching The Tonight Show. And they cut from a commercial, and it's my chart, the one that I had rehearsed today. I went, oh my God, this, life is so amazing. And that really, again, it compensated for all the struggling that I was going through. That
did you replace somebody, or was there somebody, a prior writer that had retired or something?
Well, there's I think a handful of people contributed over the years. Of course, when the Tonight Show was in New York, they had a lot of New York writers, great writers. And then in the West Coast, there was a guy named Mike Barone who wrote a lot of stuff for him, like long before I came on the scene. But the thing with Doc, and I think in general in my career in Hollywood, was that a lot of people were always looking for somebody who had a modern edge. And because I was 25 or 26, and I was very pop oriented. So even though I was, very focused in jazz and good at it, but I also was a rock and roll baby, Anyway, they come from the same family. So it was an easy, it was all related to me.
Doc Severinsen is still alive. He's 90 years old. I had a look at Wikipedia.
I just spoke with the band director at North Texas, and he said he's going to be playing a concert with him, I think, next week. And he's 90. When I recorded with him with Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, I think he could have been close to 80. And I would talk to some of the studio trumpet players in LA who know him really well, and they go, I don't understand this guy. He gets better. And he's playing like better than ever. And I know he's one of the most remarkable people that I've ever met. He's so focused about what he does. And again, later on, I learned when I got much closer to him when I was doing the symphonic work, because after The Tonight Show ended, about 5 years after, I didn't have any contact with him, yet I had already done the recordings in London with, my own compositions with the London Orchestras, 3 different ones. And he heard the music somehow, and there was a wonderful interview on KUSC radio, which is a classical station, a really powerful one in the West Coast. And he called me, and he said, and he left a message he left a message on my machine. He goes, "Are you the same Joe Curiale that did the Tonight Show?" He wasn't used to that I was now doing these big symphony things. And I called him back and I said, yeah, that's me, And the thing that's interesting, when I was doing the Tonight Show, which was all jazz, but I knew that he did incredible concert work as well, because I saw him when I was a teenager. I was in the first row center when he played with the Symphony Orchestra. The first half were all like very difficult trumpet concerti, and then the second half were more of the pop jazz things. And he never missed a note. The whole night. And I think, for any trumpet players out there, towards the end of the second half, he ends up on an E flat above double high C, and it with no microphone, and it like blew the whole concert hall away. And I went back and met him afterwards, to autograph my program, So it's something, if you can imagine how I feel, look back on my career and you're just going, well, I remember when I was a student and, just idolizing these people. And then later on, they're inviting me to conduct them. So, I remember he did even though I recorded Blue Windows with him in London, with the London Orchestra, he wanted to do the world premiere with the Phoenix Symphony. And so, of course, he asked me to conduct it. And I had these moments, of course, we're working as peers now, but he's still, I'm still he's still like a childhood hero. So I'm conducting, but in the corner of my eye, getting ready to give him a cue, I had this aha moment, and it's just like, oh my God, that's Severinsen. But there's no time. I have to, watch where I'm conducting and everything. But it was still the same thing. I'm going, wow, life is so unbelievable.
The imposter syndrome. Are you familiar with that term where somebody they don't feel like they belong because they always feel inadequate for the task at hand. Even though they might be totally ready for that job, there's that gnawing sense of self-doubt. Did you ever have that when you were put into this big position?
Generally speaking, no. I remember when I first got to Los Angeles and I'm going over the hill into the San Fernando Valley where basically everybody for the most part lived, and the NBC was there, and I see all the lights, and I'm just going, God, everybody that I really admire, they're there. And I had this again, this kind of intuitive moment that just goes, well, they're all so great, but if I stay true to myself, then there will be nobody else like me. You know what I mean? That we all learn by imitation as we're growing. That's kind of like the rites of passage of learning. But at some point you have to let go of it and you have to find your own voice. So although I never lost my awe of all these musicians and always was incredibly, to this day, respectful to everybody, but I also had this inner sense that, well, I have something that's equally as strong. Of course, it got stronger and stronger and stronger the more successes I had, but it's a wonderful feeling. By the time I left Hollywood, even before that I had no fear of anything or anyone. Great respect, but no fear, and I still don't. But that also is because I was really prepared. You'd be a fool if you're not really prepared. That would be arrogance. It's not arrogance.
Your development as a arranger, as a writer, and can we, if we could just walk down memory lane now, right to the beginning, if we could. Now, it's pretty amazing. Maybe we could just start with, how did you get into music?
Well, I'm Italian. I'm 100%. So even though I'm an American, citizen, and of course it's part of the culture. Music and the arts is just, since you're born, you're surrounded by it all the time. So I was involved in music and theater, since I was a child, and then I think it was, always listening to popular music. That's for sure. And it was like towards the end of elementary school, I had a bunch of friends that were a little older than me, and maybe they were in high school and they were in a jazz band, really cool jazz band in the high school. They're great teachers. And, I wanted to be a part of all that. And then I started listening to a lot of jazz albums, maybe starting around the 7th grade. So I must have been about 12 or something. You
mentioned in a previous talk that you had an amazing teacher in North Texas State, or was that much later?
No, actually.
Where you were a teaching assistant?
Well, he originally was at the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut. And that's where I grew up. And he was there before he went to North Texas. And so he was my mentor. In a way, I wrote about him in the book that I wrote, that it was basically, looking back, it was kind of like he was a kung fu master and I was his disciple. And very Eastern, really. When I later in life learned more about ancient Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy, I go, that was my relationship with him. He said very little, and yet I learned so much from him. And 20 years after that, I think it was in 2000 or something, I wrote to him and shared with him all the wonderful things I got to do. And I said, well, thanks for everything. He goes, but I didn't teach you anything. I said, but I learned so much from you. And it was that whole thing. There's a I think it's a quote of Lao Tzu that basically says the teacher doesn't teach, but the student learns, or something like that. So I had this very amazing relationship with him where
what's his name, if you don't mind me asking?
His name is Neil Slater. And I think it was about 5 years after I graduated with my bachelor's program, he got the job taking over the 1 O'Clock Band at North Texas, which is really famous. I mean, the players that have come out of there, like Lyle Mays and Mark Johnson, the bass player. I mean, Gary Grant, one of Jerry Hayes' horn section. I mean, it's on Greg Bissonette. I mean, on and on and on. And when I was in the bachelor's program, the North Texas, those students were just like light years ahead of where I felt I was. But when I heard he got the job, I go, boy, what a perfect match. And he was there for 27 years. And now the most amazing thing is only a few days ago, I had a reunion with him after 41 years.
What, just a few days ago?
I was in the U.S. a few days ago,
wow.
and I went to see him. And it was the new head of the 1 O'Clock Band. He was a student of his as well, but I'm probably 20 years older than him. And then another great musician who teaches at North Texas was there as well. And they all love him. And they told him that, I was in town and, I'd love to meet him. And man, we both cried. And it was, I just was, telling him how much he meant to me. And he goes, yeah, but you're a star. You're a star.
You said you were observing him and taking a lot of things from him. Was he a piano player?
He's a great jazz piano player. And he's 87 and he still plays every Thursday night in a little club.
Wow.
I wish I had been there, to see him play. But
what exactly were you taking from him?
Well, the most key thing was jazz arranging and the lab band, the big band. Mm. But with the jazz arranging class, I think I was always so self-motivated. So he picked up on that. And for example, in the jazz arranging class, you're supposed to come in every week with 8 bars of something that you were going to work on, so that at the end of the semester, you'd have a chart done. And I used to come in every week with 1 or 2 complete charts every week. And I was just like whipping them out,
At that point in your life, were you going through a particular artist or a phase of something you were listening, or was it just everything?
Well, I mean, again, I was listening to a lot of funk. I was listening to a lot of, I'm very R&B oriented. Again, it's part of the jazz family. And listening to everything, basically. Not a lot of classical music at that time, but jazz, a lot of big band stuff. I loved Maynard Ferguson, and I had almost like all his albums, which there were many. At one point, I had about 60 different albums. Woody Herman, Stan Kenton, all of those big, Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, Count Basie, a lot of small group stuff.
If somebody wanted to ask you, Dr. Joseph, if I want to learn the best of the best in big band arranging, who should I look to as a model?
Well, I have to say, with the exception of, hanging around my mentor at that time, I have to say that I didn't really learn what I did in college at all. I learned it from my record collection. And I'd say the Maynard Ferguson albums, he was on this label called Roulette, and it basically was all through the 60s. And that right there was my education, again, along with Thad Jones, Mel Lewis Consummation album. That was a really important album. Any of the Basie stuff, like Neil Hefti, Atomic Basie, and I mean, there's too many of the Basie albums to even mention. There were just so many of those big bands and Kenton. The thing that I loved about Kenton was because in a way I was always looking further than the big band and always looking towards orchestra. But I figured, how am I ever going to get a chance to work with strings and everything? So I would start, especially when I got to Hollywood, and that's what made me stand out, I think, even in that genre, was that I wasn't writing the typical swing charts everybody else was doing. I was, the players were all great double reed players, and they were doublers, so I can write for English horn as well as alto and flute and clarinet and bass clarinet and all this other stuff. So I experimented and got the big band to sound like it was an orchestra. And I remember some famous people, band leaders or something, coming down to the Union and stopping in and listening, going, "Wow, this is great." And I remember I felt like, well, I have to have one blues chart in there. And I'm sitting down trying to write this, and I'm going, man, I'm sick of the blues. And actually, I did that. I wrote a chart, that chart called "Sick of the Blues." It became the closing theme of the Tonight Show. So I just gave a copy of it today to Jeremy Montero.
Oh, I had him on the show 2 weeks ago.
Oh, because It's so amazing. He's worked with a lot of my friends from LA, Ernie Watts and Bob Shepard and Randy Brecker and all these people. And I'm going, this is my 32nd year coming to Singapore, and I had heard about him for about 30 years. I never met him, so I asked one of the lecturers, Wei Xiang at La Salle, I said, I haven't met him, because he asked me something about big band. So he arranged, and I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we had dinner together. It was like meeting an old friend. He told me about the big band, and I said, well, I have some of the Tonight Show charts. I think, digital copies, I can send them to you. You can print them out. And I just sent it today. I sent them. Sick of the Blues was one of them. So.
Oh, that would be a great education to look at those charts. Now, I wanted to ask you, were you always writing music as a kid? Were you always making little pieces? Were you always experimenting, improvising? Was that something you always did, or did you learn to do that?
No, I learned to do, but melodies were always in my head. And I was a jazz trumpet player from a very young age. While I was still, in my teens, I didn't take up the trumpet until 8th grade. And I think, about 2 years later, I won like best jazz soloist at a famous jazz competition that were, Clark Terry, different people were like judges in these kind of, they rotate. I won the best jazz soloist, trumpet soloist, and I was more interested in arranging. It wasn't until, and all during university when I was with Neil Slater, working with him, it was all arranging. Composition didn't come into my mind, although arranging is composing as well. Until I went to Japan, and it was amazing. Somebody asked me, why are you always arranging other people's music? Why don't you write your own? And I was like, duh, yeah, why, but the same thing happened to me when I was making the break from Hollywood, and I wanted to go into concert music and write for the big symphony orchestras. I'm going, it's a lot easier to arrange because you have a set of parameters. You have a tune, basic chart structure that you're using. You have a certain kind of a band that you're working for. It's a little easier, in my opinion, to fill in the blanks. But when you're starting with a blank piece of paper and no parameters, it took me a little bit to find my way. But once I started, it's kind of like I didn't want to go back, to. So when I did the Tonight Show, those were all original compositions that I also arranged, and they really helped me to stay. They were considered feature performances for. The performing rights societies like ASCAP and BMI. So each time they played, I made quite a bit of money. And, so I wrote for the Tonight Show for 11 years, and they kept playing those charts for 11 years. So it helped me to financially get going, and that kind of thing. So I think listening to great records is one of the best educations you can possibly get. Not only that, though, the important thing was where Neil Slater helped me. The jazz band at the university I went was very good. So I could write 8 bars, or I can write a whole chart, and next week I could come in and have them play it. And I remember he said something to me, after I hadn't spoken to him for 20 years, he said, I still remember the first day that the band played one of your charts. He goes, your eyes were like wide open. He says, you said to me, this is what I want to do. And so he always gave me the room to grow. So the problem is if you can't hear it, to me in music, when I write music, it's just a bunch of dots of potentiality, and dots of intention, but it needs musicians to breathe life into it. Now, I can say something that I always tell musicians, composers, and young composers and arrangers is get the very best players to play your music, because if you get half-baked players to do this, it can be a real problem. Because if you have a rotten performance, you're going to blame yourself probably. You're going to go, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. But if you have great players playing it, almost everything sounds incredible.
It's such a different world now that you have, because you were in that world where you had live players. Nowadays, a lot of people are using samples. Could you talk a little bit about that change?
Yeah, because when I made the transition now into popular songwriting in Hollywood, and then I started, electronic equipment really started to get very popular at time around in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. They had the first polyphonic synth, which was the Prophet 5. But I didn't have $5,000. And, they were $5,000. Now you can get a software version of that for, $50 or something. So it's kind of like there's good news, bad news to all this kind of stuff. So technology has taken over, which makes it easier to make records. I can make a record, on the kitchen table, and I do, and they sound really good. But I still, the last 2 albums I did that were electronic based, they all still have human beings on them. I'll have the guys from Yellow Jackets, Alphonso Johnson played, Randy Brecker played. What's his name? Everett Harp just played on the new one. The drummer from The Doors, John Densmore. I mean, so they add that something. I even though when I did my PhD, I was going to dedicate myself totally to electronic music because I wanted to do that while I was in LA, but I didn't really have the time or to do it. So, and I set out that when I do my dissertation, it's going to be all electronic. It turns out it was all electronic, but it wasn't all me. I wanted to do it all myself, but as I'm writing, I'm going, I hear Jimmy Haslip. I hear Russell Ferrante playing this. I hear, this, and then, and I would add them, and they added so much life to the tracks, that kind of.
All your years having great players play for you, can you name a couple who really stood out to you, just like, wow, that was amazing?
Oh, boy, there's so many of them. I wouldn't know where to.
Off the top of your head.
Well, of course, Doc Severinsen. Absolutely. Let's see, who else? I lean more towards the trumpet players, but... Bobby Shue, Chuck Finley. Oh my God, these guys are just, even on their worst day, is better than anybody else's good day in an entire lifetime.
I saw you've worked with Quincy Jones. He himself no slouch at arranging.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, again, I grew up listening to his album. The first album I had of his was called Smackwater Jack, and I loved it. That's, of course, he was in Hollywood at that time, and I remember he wrote the theme to a TV show called Ironsides, and I loved it. And he did a new version on there, and he also did Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On." He actually sang it. It's not the greatest voice, but there's something really nice about it. There's a charm to it. And of course, I always was reading the liner notes to see who all the musicians are, just going, oh, wow, look at all these incredible players. So, of course, and then I think when I was in Japan, living in Japan, he had done Michael Jackson's first album, Off the Wall, and that was like huge. And then, so when I got to Hollywood, I knew about he was doing all these records and Jerry Hay Horn section, all these people were working with him. And then when I got to Columbia Pictures, when I finally was signed to Columbia Pictures, the vice president of Columbia Pictures knew him very well. And he was doing a movie for Columbia Pictures, Quincy Jones, and he had a writing team that he put together. And it was like the who's who. It was Rod Temperton who wrote all Michael Jackson. It was James Ingram.
Whoa.
People that, they weren't big at that moment, but they went on to become multi-gazillionaires, like Saida Garrett, who wrote Man in the Mirror and sang it with Michael. She was just starting out when I was, and I remember sitting right next to her. We became friends. She used to sing my demos for $40.
Wow.
Glenn Ballard, who was a songwriter there a little bit before me, I guess, and he ended up producing Alanis Morissette, Wilson Phillips, Dave Matthews Band, and I remember sometime after that making a $25 million deal with Capitol Records. Amazing stuff.
You became the very first staff songwriter in Columbia Pictures history. How did you get that gig? And you clearly were special for them to really make that position for you.
Well, when I look back, it's just, I just lived my life on love, the love of what I was doing and the love of music and the love of being around great musicians and all of this. And LA was kind of, I still say it was like the big dream machine. Anything you can dream, everything that you need to make those dreams come true are there. Everybody's so good at what they do. So, when I got to LA, I kind of figured out early on that at that time, jazz was really getting out of favor. So I either people tipped me off or I figured it out or both. But I figured I'm going to have to really downplay my jazz background, but it really helped me anyway. But later on, so I go because people like to pigeon. I don't know if you know the phrase pigeonhole.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
label you, and so I figure, well, if I'm going to get labeled, I want to get labeled in the way I can make the best living and enjoy myself. And so since I was always a melody person, I just wanted to be a songwriter. And here I am starting from scratch in a way. And then I had a friend from university. Actually, he went to the same university as me, University of Bridgeport again. And he was already kind of working as a songwriter. And then so I started writing with him, and then things started branching out. So I was really broke, but every little amount of money I got together, I would scrape it together and pay musicians to do a demo, because there's no sequencers or anything like that. I just started sending them out, sending the tapes out. I mean, I was so poor, I didn't even have a way to make a tape copy. So, it was amazing, because one of the best studio players, a trombone player named Alan Kaplan in Hollywood, who's still playing and still at the top of his game, he had befriended one of the stars of a very famous TV show called Happy Days.
Yeah, Happy Days.
So it's the redhead guy, Donnie Most, and who played Ralph Malph. And he was my favorite on Happy Days anyway, but he was a big band freak. And he's actually doing a big band thing right now. And so he used to follow Buddy Rich's band around whenever they were near where he was. And he'd always talk to Alan. So when he wanted to do some charts, he wanted to do a live cabaret kind of thing, he asked Alan, who do you recommend for, to do some charts? And Alan recommended me. And this is, again, the same that I'm sleeping on this guy's floor, in his storeroom. And so it would be like almost like you're sleeping in somebody's bomb shelter here, or something.
Now, this Columbia Pictures gig was before The Tonight Show, or was it after The Tonight Show?
After.
And you mentioned there was someone who really believed in you and helped you, really was your advocate to get that position. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I didn't have the money to even make a tape copy, and I did the charts for this star from Happy Days, and we became such good friends, and he knew that I didn't have even a way to make a cassette. He had a really nice tape set up at his house, and he lived in Malibu looking over the ocean. And I mean, he trusted me so much. He gave me the keys to his house when he was working, and he said, "Here, you go ahead and make copies of my house." And so I would send them out to all the publishers and everything. And so what happens was that the guy who ended up signing me at Columbia Pictures, he was a friend of Donnie Most as well. So when we actually did the show at a jazz club in Hollywood, I conducted the pieces that I arranged for him, and this guy remembered me. And so here I am sending out songs. This guy was from UCLA, and he was interning at Arista Music Publishing. He told me the story is unbelievable. I had sent my tape of songs to Arista, hoping that maybe they would sign them or sign me as a writer. And his job as an intern was to kind of go through all these tapes. He said there was a giant basket of tapes with hundreds of tapes. He said my tape was on the top.
Oh, wow.
And he said he remembered my name. And he listened to it, and he liked it, and he invited me to come down to Arista.
Do you remember what was on that tape, that particular demo?
I think I might remember one or two songs that might be on there. And he said there's a famous author named Carlos Castaneda, and he said the two on the top were you and Carlos Castaneda. Oh, my God. And so we stayed in contact. And one thing that he really liked was that I was very versatile. So I would do jazz, and I would be doing Japanese music and fusion with an orchestra, and I'd be doing all these different things. And after a while, he said, I'm up for this job at Columbia Pictures. He said, if I get that job, he says, I'm going to sign you first. I'm going, oh, man. Because I was really starving. I was still really starving. Even though I had the Tonight Show, it's, LA is a very, very expensive place to live. So and so it was like going from, in a way, 0 to 100. Well, it was 0 to 100 in a way when I got the Tonight Show. But that Tonight Show I got, in the later part of 1981, and I was signed to Columbia Pictures 2 years later, almost the same time, 2 years later, 1983. And every famous writer in town wanted the job. because, I'm talking about Hall of Fame writers that had a lot of number one hits.
Were you aware of is that what happens in Hollywood? Are you always aware of whoever is around at the time and who's working?
Well, the thing of it is there, like, for example, in the Musicians Union book, there could be like 10,000 members in the Musicians Union, but there are only a couple of hundred that actually do all the work. So
no kidding.
So it's like that do the big work anyway. So it's a small, believe it or not, it's quite a small community, and everybody knows everybody. And you start making the rounds, and you start, I'm working at one publisher, writing with their writer, and then some hugely famous writer comes in, and I'm like, oh my God, I love the songs that this guy wrote, and blah blah blah. I just made the rounds enough, and I didn't know at the time. I mean, some of the stuff I'm telling you, I knew after the fact, but. Because even when I was there, it was still a parade of famous songwriters wanting to get signed to Columbia Pictures. But I do remember, and I had really very little track record. So it's amazing that I got it. But I think, first of all, I was cheaper than it would be. If they signed one of those big Hall of Fame persons, they may have had to make $1 million deal.
No track record. I mean, you don't get any credit for The Tonight Show. That's like a huge thing, right?
Yeah, it was a big deal to my friend who signed me. But I mean, as a songwriter, I hadn't had hits yet or anything like that. But this guy had heard a lot of the songs that I had written and really liked them. And it's there's a lot more to it than writing great songs. You have to have some people behind you, or you have to know a lot of people to be able to get your song to the right place to get it recorded, by an artist. So, and that was where the publishers very often were very helpful. They had a staff of people called professional managers that you could call them song pluggers that would go out and plug your songs. They know, Whitney Houston is recording. She's, let's get your song to her, So they make their own relationships. So all you have to do is write, you know what I mean? But before I got that, I used to have to do everything. And it was like 99% slam doors, No, I don't hear it. I don't hear it. I don't hear the chorus. The chorus is not strong enough. This is not strong enough. Just going, well, thank you very much.
Who is the guy listening and doing the judging? Is it an A&R type person?
Well, if it was a record company, it would be an A&R person. If it was a publishing company, it would be, like I said, the song plugger, professional manager. Or if it was a small publishing company, it could be the director of the publishing company. But, I was a bit shy, but I learned to be very assertive very quickly. Not aggressive, but assertive, because if I didn't, I couldn't survive. I couldn't eat. And so I had to really push myself all the time to meet people and know that there's a 99% chance that the door is going to get slammed,
In hindsight, people would say things like that, like, oh, I don't hear it. Did they have a point, or were they not judging you with enough fairness at the time?
Of course, sometimes that they may have had, it may have been valid, but sometimes I didn't agree with them at all. For example, a lot of the people that slammed the door on me when I got signed to Columbia Pictures, literally, they were saying to the head of the company, "Where did you find him? Oh my God, he's so great." I wanted to say, "You turned me down." But you don't want to make enemies. Because a lot of these people really had an upward trajectory and ended up in bigger and bigger and bigger positions. Right. Becoming really the heads of companies, etc. So that's kind of how I did it. So I did get signed, and I remember the president. To meet the president of Columbia, these are like really, in their own right, they are superstars in their own world.
Yeah.
And really brilliant guy, and he basically said, "You got 1 year." He's like, "You have 1 year to make money for this company." And it's pretty. It was pretty heavy, because perhaps the whole publishing company would have closed, not only me, And it's the same thing with Kit Chan if we get there later. I was told by my friend who's one of the owners of OB Music that when I did her first couple of albums, they said, especially the first album, if it didn't hit, the OB Music would have had to close. Wow. So I've been in this position before where there's a lot of pressure. I didn't know that at the time, and I really didn't have any investment in OB Music. They became early friends here, and I just did it for fun.
Right.
I'm in Singapore. It would be pretty cool to work with a local singer. But once I met Kit, we became like instant great friends, and I thought she was brilliant in every way.
Incredible. Yeah, I'm just amazed at the pressure that you faced, because it's kind of like the movie industry, because there's so much riding on one movie. In the way, your song, when you were writing it, there's a lot of pressure to make sure it's a hit.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and again, maybe, I don't know, a few weeks or so, or a month or something, or a couple of months after I signed with Columbia Pictures, the vice president told Quincy Jones, I want my guy on that film, part of that writing team. So they opened the doors for me, and all the songs for that movie got thrown out. That movie wasn't very good, but the song that I wrote, I hooked up with a very famous musician producer named Ollie Brown, and the song that we got that was rejected became the song that started the breakdance soundtrack, and that soundtrack bumped Prince "Purple Rain" off competition. So within 6 months or so, I already had a hit, and
that must have felt fantastic.
Oh, it was. I mean, for myself and for the head of the company who believed in me and signed me because his neck was on the line too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then that just opened up a whole bunch of doors. Then I did the next breakdance movie.
How familiar were you with breakdancing?
Not at all, but it was an easy slide because I've always been a part of black music since I was a kid. So that's why the black musicians were really they gravitated toward me. Like a classic story is later on in Hollywood. Earth, Wind and Fire, Al McKay, who wrote September. I mean, he's like one of the greatest rhythm guitar players alive. He heard tracks that I did, and he called me up. He said, I want you to come down to the studio. I want you to produce me. And so I show up at his place, and I did not take this as an insult. He looks at me and smiles. He goes, I didn't expect a white guy. So that's what I'm saying. It's not about color. I always tell my students it's about culture. I'm a white guy, but I grew up in black culture in more ways than one. And so for me, working with most of the popular music I did in Hollywood was all with, black musicians, Barry White, Ray Parker Jr., on and on and on. And then all the big TV shows like Ray Charles. You've probably seen the list.
Let's talk really briefly about that Michael Jackson concert that you did, where you said you were working until 5 a.m, or something, really late night getting everything together.
Well, this is again put in a brand new situation. My contract with Columbia Pictures just ended because the company was sold, and I was wondering, oh wow, I've been on contract for 6 months. I'm getting a regular advance on my royalties, even though I was doing freelance work in addition. But I go, now I'm 100% freelance. I'm hoping I can, make a good living at this. And it was just like some kind of a blessing. Maybe a month later, I get a call. And it was a musical director from New York that was coming out to LA to do these big TV specials. You have a lot of musical guests on them. And he said, you're the only person whose name was on all the lists of every contractor that I had. And the issue was, again, there were a lot of people that can do the traditional stuff, blah, blah, blah. But he wanted somebody who could do Broadway, who could do the traditional TV variety stuff, but somebody who had a real pop edge. And I was the only one. And so so my first time working with him, and it's for Sammy Davis. I mean, he was dying. And so Quincy Jones again's involved. And it's the who's who of Hollywood involved in performing to pay their respect to Sammy Davis on his TV special. And so for 2 weeks, I worked really hard doing all the charts for a lot of these big stars. And then there was always this rumor flying around, because this is when Michael Jackson really was the king of pop. It was 89. He was at the top. So, Thriller and Bad, whatever. So, but it never materialized that he was going to do it. So the show taped tomorrow. I finished today. And so I went back to my place and just, kind of like crash on the bed and just going, oh, thank God I could just like lay down watching The Tonight Show. And then midnight, the phone rings and it's the musical director. And he said, Michael's going to do it. But it tapes tomorrow tomorrow. I'm going, he goes, he wrote a song for a tribute to Sammy Davis. He goes, you want to do the orchestration arrangement? I said, of course I said yes, but in the back of my mind I was going, my God, I'm so exhausted. I said, but I'm going, this is probably a once in a lifetime shot here. So I said, of course. So at 1 o'clock, they sent, in the morning, they sent a messenger over with the cassette tape. And I have this tape somewhere, Michael Jackson sitting at a piano playing this. And
Wait, can I stop you for a second now? Can he play the piano? Because I read an interview with one of his keyboard players that he doesn't really play.
Who, Michael? Well, I think somebody else might have. I think it was the writer of the show actually could play, and he wrote the lyrics, or they had, or
Okay.
he had some player. But when I mean Pat the piano, I should have clarified that he was singing it. It was just a piano vocal.
Okay, got it, gotcha.
And so I got it, and then had to start, doing the arrangement and the orchestration. They said, well, we're sending a messenger at 8:00 in the morning to pick it up so that we can send it to the copyists because the rehearsal's at noon. And so, I was already really exhausted. And so when it came to about 5 in the morning and I still wasn't finished, I actually started crying. I kind of obsess about making sure everything's fine. And I knew, especially in this situation, there cannot be an error, because it would be like total egg on my face if I did that, because I was going to be at the rehearsal and he was going to be there and he was going to run it through. And I didn't want anything to reflect bad on the musical director, because he was a real pro, man. He was just like, especially being from New York, it was boom, boom, boom. If you went to Boston, the East Coast thing is very, very high intensity. So it's like, they're like, get it done, get it done, get it done. I don't want any mistakes, no mistakes, that kind of thing. So I knew there were a lot of people depending on me, and I have my reputation, especially I'm just starting off on this new venture of doing these big TV specials. And so I just wanted to make sure that it was really perfect. And so, yeah, I had my moment there of weeping. And then, just continued and wrote. I think I wrote right up until 8:00 when they picked it up, and then I went to the rehearsal. There's still that little room for doubt. I just hope everything was okay, And they ran it through like several times and no problems. And he liked it. And I went over and talked to him for a minute.
What was that like? Did you get to talk much to Michael?
I think he was talking to Eddie Murphy at the time or something. So I didn't want to interrupt, but I just excused myself. So I did the orchestration for this, and just a minute. But I had met him before at someone's house at a private party, just very briefly. And he's very quiet and very, very reserved. But again, at this time, he's on top of the world. So and it went well. And then the icing on the cake was that he and I and the musical director got nominated for an Emmy Award for it. So, oh man, wow, this is pretty great, and so that's how that happened. But I've been in those kind of trenches very often. I mean, I went through a trench like that here in Singapore in 2011 when OB Music asked me to do Music Matters. Wanted to do a big event for Japan, a kind of We Are the World, and they felt there was nobody around here that had the chops to pull it off and pull it off quickly. And so my friend Colin Go, who was one of the the founders of OB Music, said, we got this project. If you'll do it, we can accept it. But if you won't do it, we can't accept it. We can't do this. And so I accepted it because he had just rescued me from the earthquake in Japan.
Oh, wow.
So I was here and I stayed at his house for a couple of weeks, and they found me a place to stay. So I said, okay, well, I'm here. I'll do it. And I have a presentation just on that, how that came together. It had to come together very fast. And there are a handful of people around that locally, like his brother Zenon is a wonderful engineer. I worked with him. And so there are, now, of course, compared to 32 years ago or 30 years ago when I was doing kids albums, I couldn't find musicians. I'm sure they were here, but I couldn't really find them.
Right,
now there are a lot better musicians, but there's still a nagging problem that still exists, and that's attitude. That has not improved over the years. Forgive me for saying so, but I say that with a lot of love because I was brought here to help these students, these really good students or good musicians, to hopefully make it through to something big. But I'm going, but it doesn't matter how good your chops are. You're going to have to. Your personality is going to have to improve. The way you deal with people, of course, being on time, all these things that are just, for the most part, I don't see it happening yet.
Man, if I had a Joseph Curiale hanging around in Singapore when I was a kid, man, I would have just picked your brain all day. I would have just followed you around.
most people, I remember one time I was so desperate. This is in the early '90s. I went to Boat Key or something and went to clubs on my own just to try to find a guitar player, anybody, and I somebody.
My God.
And he goes, I asked this guitar player, I said, "Would you like to do a session? This is for a kid." He goes, "Well, how long is it going to take?" I said, I was polite, and I just go, "This guy doesn't have a clue." And so from then on, I almost never used local musicians. Until this day, I don't use local musicians either. And it's sad because, I've been living here.
Hopefully the culture changes. And I think, as long as we're aware of it, and this goes for any country, really, I think the first step is awareness, and really, then you can take action. But if people are not aware that there is an issue, then there's a big problem.
Well, I tell you, at LaSalle, I've had 3 years. And any students who have worked with me during that 3 years are very well aware of it, because I've made a big issue out of it. The talent, a lot of talent there. I can say it's a lot better than I could find years ago. That's a good thing. But now there are a whole other, I always say, like, for example, in Hollywood, if the success equation is going to be a minimum 60%, 60 to 70% is going to be your personality. The fact of being good is a given. I always use a baseball analogy. Being great is the ticket into the ballpark, but it does not mean you're going to get up to play. You're not going to get up to bat. The things that are going to bring you up to bat is how much people like you, how responsible are you a good team player, are you dependable, all these kind of things play into it. Look, when I was in university, I wasn't getting paid for it, but instead of bringing 8 bars in, I'm bringing in 2 charts every week. So that happens to be with my personality. I always say it's love, man.
We're running out of time, so I got to ask you about your orchestral work, because that's something I've listened to it. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Really quick, couple of quick questions. Do you have any favorite classical composers, and briefly why?
Ravel, definitely. I think for orchestration, probably the most wonderful orchestrator, and the sensitivity and the delicate, the delicate way he handles orchestration. I love that, and of course, I love everything about Ravel. And for big melodies and for passion, of course, Rachmaninoff. And I have presentations that I give where Rachmaninoff pieces were actually transformed into some of the biggest hits. Like, for example, All by Myself. The verse in All by Myself is a direct ripoff of
Rachmaninoff. Yeah, that happened quite a bit. I think there's I think Avalon, that standard. I think that's from an Italian opera. I can't remember, but that was in a minor key.
Well, I have a whole presentation. It's called the Classical Connection, where I'll play the classical thing, and then I'll play what it became. There are a lot of them.
You know what I loved about the early 19th century was a lot of the classical composers used to hang out with the jazz people. I know for a fact that Fats Waller and Rachmaninoff were good friends, and that's what quoted for Fats Waller. Rachmaninoff is my friend. And Horowitz hanging out with Tatum. That's all just wonderful stuff. Now I feel it's kind of segregated. Now people are getting into their own spheres. But I love the idea that if you love music, you love everything. And you love a good musician, you love everything about good music. And it really is across all genres. Now let's talk about your composition. So what made that switch from from jazz to pop and then to classical music?
Well, I was just taking everything that I had before and just now putting in this elegant setting. The melodies were strong and beautiful. The harmonies were definitely, I can pull out all the jazz vocabulary. And because like sometimes I get compared to Copland, which is quite an honor. But I go, well, Copland didn't have the harmonic chops that I have, So being a jazz person, of course, he and Stravinsky dabbled in jazz, and it's complete garbage, as far as I'm concerned. So it's really the same thing. Like, for example, the third movement of Gates of Gold, Call of the Mountain, which is one of the most popular pieces in my repertoire, the most requested. Well, at the end, the big glorious ending, I'm listening to the progression. One day I'm going, oh, wow, that's Don't Worry Baby by the Beach Boys. It's the same, because I was a Beach Boy fan, but now it's in this different setting. Or, I would be in the control room at Abbey Road listening to a playback, and maybe the principal cellist would come back and listen to the playback, and he'd turn to me and go, do you fancy jazz? And, well, yes, I do. So you could hear it in the harmony. But the way I did it, and I don't do it intellectually. There's no process involved. It's just I do it intuitively.
You have a PhD in composition. How does that jive with the classical training of a typical composer, with your more organic and working with jazz and using your ears?
I didn't want to get a PhD in composition, but it was if I wanted to get funded, because I was already a composer of note, the best thing is to do is to get it in composition.
Yeah.
But I didn't want it. I wanted to do musicology because I was afraid the way academia is that they would ruin me.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
So I was very fortunate that when I did my master's and PhD, that the composition teachers there knew about where I was coming from, and they just backed off. They just we had a wonderful relationship, and the time we spent together talking about music, they weren't trying to turn me into anything, that kind of thing.
Did you ever do like counterpoint exercises or any of that kind of thing when you were when it comes to composition and part of your training? Do you think like in terms of counterpoint or that kind of thing, or does it all do you have it in your head and you fill out the blanks as it goes along?
Well, because of being a melody person, I sometimes can hear counter melodies because loving popular music, and when you think of the vocalist singing a melody, there's one melody, and the great arrangers are going to come up with these beautiful counter melodies in the strings or in the woodwinds or something. So my mind is always focused on that. And of course, I admire all composers who write great counterpoint. So that was one of the things all the years in Hollywood and beyond that I was going, I want to improve and keep exploring beautiful counterpoint. I think the thing that I did with Doc Severinsen called Blue Windows on the Awakening CD is probably my best example of the best of my counterpoint. And it really flowed absolutely effortlessly. And almost like channeling. That's what my experience is like. It's like channeling, that I don't intellectualize anything. Like a channel opens and this music just starts flying through, and the challenge is just to keep up my hand, to keep up, the pencil of writing down, basically like taking dictation in a way.
I love what you said about Stravinsky earlier. I think there was a quote from Barry Harris who said something about Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which is a great piece, but he said
that is different. Gershwin's different.
Yeah, Gershwin's. But he said, "You think that's the best jazz? Get out of here."
But I'm not alone.
No, I love that. And I like honest opinions, because people are so terrified. They're so cowed by, I don't know what it is, but they say, "Oh, you can't comment about this. This guy is a god. You can't say anything about this person." And you get that a lot in the classical world, where you can't even change a note, because they'll turn around and say to you, "Do you think you're better than that composer? How dare you?" And it's quite a ridiculous idea.
Well, there's too many people think too highly of themselves and take themselves too seriously. And I think, there's so many metaphors of life in music. I've learned more about life, I think, through music. For example, everybody wants to classify you, as I said, well, it's classical or it's jazz. So if you're very versatile, to me, it's all music. Does it move me emotionally? That's all I care. Does it make me groove? Does it have a pocket? I mean, classical music has a pocket as well. So, they're the best stuff. So I don't like being pigeonholed. So the fact that the symphonic music that I write, or the chamber music that I write, is really all those elements are in it. I'm writing another popular piece. It's called Adelina de Maya. So it's a Spanish piece, and there's one section I'm going, I wonder how Dave Garibaldi of Tower of Power would turn the time around if I can write the whole orchestra turning the time around like he does as a drummer. Of course, he's a friend of mine. So I'm going, but if you listen to it, you don't know that. I'm going, but I'm taking references from, funk music, and yet it's showing up with the London Symphony and played for 21 years nonstop on classical radio and still going strong. So, you know what I mean? So I don't like, I don't like to say, you're this, you're that, or same thing with races. Well, you're this, you're that, or religions. I'm not for anything that divides people, and I'm all for anything that integrates people and music and all these kind of things. So music is life. So one of the albums called The Music of Life,
What do you think of music being an analogy of being a language? How do you think that's appropriate, or what's your analogy for music?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a very, very high language, getting up there into like the ET realm, you know what I mean? And, because sound goes on forever. Once the sound is made, it goes on into infinity. So I think it's really important to make sure that when you're playing something or writing something that you have really great intention, because you can't take it back. I think it is, because I remember when I did a tour when I a couple of years after I got out of did my bachelor's degree. I did a world tour with the Glenn Miller Orchestra as jazz trumpet player, and we went to Bulgaria. We were like the first non-communist act or something in Bulgaria in years, and we played a concert there. Now here, people are supposed to hate each other because they're communists and Americans are not. At the end of the concert, the people were stomping so loud it sounded like there was an earthquake. Everybody got scared because they wouldn't stop until we came back and did an encore. Point. That's love, man. That is love. Love. This music went way past any political ideologies, went way past any religious ideologies, and went right to the heart. I think if it wasn't for music, our species would probably be gone already.
I'd be very curious to hear about the anthropological history of music. They found those bone flutes 30,000 years ago. It's interesting because our human brain hasn't changed that much. We know that the Olympics had contests for musical improvisation. So there might have been some bad players back during the Olympics in the ancient Greeks.
Always going to be, absolutely.
Now, I have a quick question. Do you have perfect pitch or highly developed relative pitch, or both?
I have good relative pitch, and from what I know from friends who have perfect pitch, it's actually sometimes can work against you, because if you have to transpose on the spot, it really throws you. Because you're looking at the music, it's supposed to be an A, but you have to put it up a step, and now it's a B, but you're looking at an A. It's like, it freaks them out, I think, some people who have perfect pitch. So I think it's a blessing, more of a blessing for me in a way.
Final question for you. What did you think of the big band arrangement in the movie Whiplash?
Well, I think a lot of people that I know in LA, did those charts, but I hated that movie so much. I'd like to just get rid of it. I came across it tonight. When I watched it, I really hated it. I go, this is wrong.
The story, just the story? Is it?
The story. I hated it. That the competition thing and the humiliating people. I go, that's there's no love in there, man. I mean, you can argue it that they wanted the student to be really good, but I don't really subscribe to that kind of a method. But the music, of course, is going to be really good, and there are going to be great, writers, LA writers that most likely did that. I have to go back and do research to see who actually did it, but I'm sure I know who they are.
Now, I want to end on one quote that you gave, which I really liked. If you risk nothing, you risk everything. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely, because there's another one that goes with it. No guts, no glory. I mean, if you don't take a chance, people are afraid to try. Because they're afraid to fail. But I say, if you don't try, you already failed. And when I look back at myself and think that I could have been fearful when I came over the hill on the 405 freeway and saw the lights of the San Fernando Valley, if I had gotten afraid and turned around, I would have missed out on the best 30 years of my life.
Dr. Joseph, listen, it's been a treat. You've been such a great guest, and I do hope you'll come back again. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your interview. Thanks.